Oh, yeah. I'm sure you're loving the great music we're playing for you on the Fatboy Show on this beautiful, amazing Thursday morning. I hope you're doing great. Fatboy here, and as the nation grapples with all of these threats that are being issued by these Western powers in light of us passing the Anti-Homosexuality Act, our president remains defiant. When the World Bank came out and said they weren't going to be considering us for future loans and grants, the president said, yeah, who cares? If you don't want to do business with us, we shall find other people to do business with. Well, Mr. President, I hope you're looking for those business partners, because now several companies in the United States under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or Agoa, have stopped buying textiles from Uganda, citing the enactment of the Anti-Homosexuality Law of 2023. This was revealed by the president on Sunday during an event he was attending. He said, quote, "The homosexuals in the U.S. are interfering with our export of textiles. Some of the orders have been cancelled by the homosexuals there." Ooh, so things are getting serious. Now, as I understand it, Agoa was some sort of a deal that was made between our government and the U.S. government, to which they were going to grant us tariff-free and quota-free access to their markets. And I think the arrangement was that in return, we were also supposed to buy some of their items here and there. Well, nonetheless, it was intended to allow us to grow our economy by having easier access to U.S. markets. And now with several companies in the U.S. saying they're not going to be buying our textiles, to whom shall we sell our textiles? This is a huge problem. Because it's one thing to be a country where you produce all kinds of raw materials. But you see, when you're exporting raw materials, they shortchange you. They buy our raw materials for cheap. And then what ends up happening is that we don't make much money, which is why our president and even economists have argued that, look, for a country to thrive, you have to start to export processed materials, manufactured materials, because that's where you can add the value. Because when you add value to your raw materials by way of processing, let's say in the case of coffee, if you pick the coffee beans and then you roast them and then you package them and do all that kind of stuff, then you just simply export it to those markets to be sold in the supermarkets directly. You'll be able to fetch a better price for your coffee than if you were selling the raw coffee beans themselves. So this Agoa thing seemed like a great idea. We wouldn't just have to export our, bales of cotton, but we could sell textiles, clothing items that could be purchased by Americans, thereby earning Uganda, lots of money, which we were earning for the longest time. But now that several companies are coming out and saying that they're not going to be buying our textiles through this Agoa deal, well, things are going to get a lot tougher for us here in Uganda, right? Now, to the LGBT activists, I have this question. Okay, let's say we even agree, or I even agree with you, that this anti-homosexuality law is oppressive. Now, I don't believe that we even needed such a law. We have enough laws in our books that would cater to instances of defilement of minors, or of rape or forced, sexual access or sexual assault, that kind of thing. It's just, it seemed redundant for there to be a law to specifically target a sexual orientation for the same types of crimes that we normally charge heterosexuals for under the existing laws. So the law seemed rather redundant. And so just on that basis alone, I would say we don't need the law. And many people would agree. But that being the case, and you wanting the law to be repealed, does that still call for you advocating for these donors and Western nations to sanction Uganda in some way, to not give us access to loans via the World Bank, or to deny access to their markets for our exports? Do you think that helps your cause? Because to me, all that does is it further impoverishes Ugandans, and then it only engenders more hostility towards your community, your LGBT community. Because as you can see, the president is already trying to make it seem like it is the LGBT guys that are, sabotaging our economy by going around telling Western powers to not send us aid or to give us loans, and now to purchase our exports. How is that helping the cause of the LGBT? Because already, look, let's go with the worst presumptions that people have about the community, that, you have an agenda, you want to destroy society. Okay. If people already believe that, and then on top of that, because you're upset with the law that was passed against you, you then start lobbying these Western governments and institutions to deny us access to loans and to their markets, doesn't that just add more suspicion on your community? Doesn't that just attract more resentment towards your community? I would think so. So I always like to approach issues of activism with pragmatism, meaning you sit down and you look at the situation, and let's say you conclude that, yeah, the situation is not good. But that being the case, how do we proceed? Do we want to engage in activities that will make the situation worse? Or do we want to find ways of furthering our cause and our interests while at the same time not doing anything to further engender hatred towards us? See, isn't that how a pragmatic person would think? So if I was an LGBT activist, I would be saying, okay, let's see what we can do to engage with Ugandans, this community of people we live amongst and we seek acceptance from. How can we dialogue with them and talk to them and to make them realize that, maybe we deserve rights just like you, or we deserve to not be prosecuted for simply having consensual relationships with adults of the same sex or same gender. Like, why not just focus on having that kind of a dialogue rather than just instead focusing on being defiant and saying, oh no, repeal the law, we're going to keep fighting the law. In fact, watch us as we go to the World Bank and walk down the streets of Washington, D.C. to the White House and to tell them to wage war on Uganda. Wow, that only makes things worse. I don't think you're being strategic, neither do I think you're being pragmatic in taking that approach, but here we are. So, now that you are being labeled as the instigators of all of these economic punishments that are being meted out to us by these Western powers, how are you then going to convince Ugandans that you have their best intentions? There's a hint of narcissism in activism, I believe, where you're not willing to look at the bigger picture and instead you're just sort of being a bit too short-sighted. That's how a child would look at a problem. An adult would look at it more holistically and think of the best case of a worst case scenario. Do you see what I mean? You just find a way of dealing with a problem that doesn't sort of make it worse in the process. And I fear that this is exactly what's going on. And what does it mean to, on one hand, argue for your rights to be protected and engaging in activities intended to force the government to change a law that was passed into law by the legislature? Say what you will about our political system or even about the Anti-Homosexuality Law, it was passed into law through a parliamentary process. Representatives from the different constituencies across the nation sat down and all voted in favor for this bill to be passed into law. And it was assented to by the president. It was a very transparent, open, and democratic process. Now, if you happen to not like the law that was passed, do you then go to Western powers and say, please, force our government to drop this law? And just how would the government, repeal or annul the law? How would it be done? Because the legal way to do it would be to challenge it, maybe constitutionally. And I do understand that there are already people doing that, challenging this law and its constitutionality. Great. And in all likelihood, it's going to be repealed on that basis. But if instead what you want to do is to go to Washington, go to the World Bank, to the US government and say, please force the president of Uganda to scrap the law, you are essentially asking the Western powers to compel our president to perform a dictatorial act. Because think of it, what would you say if the president woke up one morning and said, oh, you see this thing that's in the law, this article in the Penal Code Act, I hereby declare it null and void by the powers vested in me as the head of state? You would say, no, actually, that's dictatorial. It was made into a law through a parliamentary process, and for you to, ignore that and to impose your will on the people of Uganda, that's you being a dictator right there. So I don't get it. If you want to be a human rights activist, be that. But to, at the same time, expect that the president will simply wake up and erase some law that exists in the books, that's a very undemocratic and a very totalitarian action. And for you to be arguing for that seems to me to be a bit of a contradiction, especially if you believe you are a champion of human rights. Well, we'll see where this goes. We're going to keep covering this story. I do suspect and also predict that this law is going to be scrapped through the legal process. And when that happens, I hope, the activists will just, number one, relax, because I guess they will be happy that it's been repealed. But secondly, think of ways of engaging with your community. And this isn't me saying that the community necessarily has an obligation to accept everything you're saying. But for there to be any positive movement, that conversation needs to take place. Because me personally, I'm liberal about this. I don't care about someone's sexual orientation. Do what you gotta do as long as you're not violating anyone's rights, you're not harming any children. Do what you wanna do. I don't care. But for the rest of the country, who have rather strong cultural and religious views, you're gonna wanna engage in conversation with them in order to, seek recognition and better acceptance if that is what you want. And if it turns out that they are still not convinced and would still like to hold on to those views, well, what are you gonna do? Don't you just have to accept that? Are you gonna force them to accept a way of life that they may not necessarily agree with? I don't think that's the right thing to do. And I do agree that they also shouldn't impose their religious beliefs and cultural beliefs on you. The best case scenario, according to me, is a bit of a live and let live scenario, as long as there's no legal prosecution. If there aren't any legal mechanisms by which you can specifically be targeted simply for your sexual orientation, then I think at that point, just take that as a win and live your life and carry on. It doesn't matter that everyone else doesn't agree with your lifestyle. As long as no one's bothering you, shouldn't that be enough? Demanding for anything more than that, to me, is totalitarianism. Well, do keep listening to The Fatboy Show. It's your number one station, RX Radio.
RX Radio.